Thank you for joining us, Joyce, to talk about inflation metrics and pressures. I think we have a presentation from you up on our website. Appreciate you sending that. I just want to say, throughout the session, we add various inflators onto various bills. Sometimes it has a touch of the willy-nilly to it. And so I am excited to be able to sort of enter the process of working on legislation with a bigger picture view of what appropriate choices might look like there. So thank you.
Good. Well, thank you for having me. For the record, I'm Joyce Manchester with the Joint Fiscal Office, and I'm very happy to talk about measures of inflation today. It's one of those things that you learn about in grad school and you think, oh, boring. And then you get to the real world and you find out that it really does matter which choices you make and when you choose to adjust for inflation. So I'm going to give you a quick overview and then we'll get right into it. I'm going to start with talking about why adjusting for inflation matters. Because one message that I really want to convey is that you always need to think about adjusting for inflation when you look at time series data, so historical data over some period of time. And it's become especially important these days because of higher rates of inflation in recent years. So we'll take a look at some pictures of what inflation has looked like historically, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of which measure is best. And finally, talk about some considerations for you all to have in the back of your minds. So we'll start with slide number 4, which is a real life figure from a recent JFO report. And it illustrates very nicely that interpretation of patterns over time can be influenced by whether the data show nominal or inflation-adjusted dollars. And when I say nominal, I mean prices in the year in which they happen, right? So prices in 2022 or prices in 2018 or whatever. And when I say inflation-adjusted, I mean I'm bringing all the prices to a common year, to 1 year. So here's the figure that was published in a report. It says, what's the average value of the earned income tax credit in Vermont? And it was described, after looking at this figure, it was described as being relatively consistent over time. And that's sort of the idea you get if you look at those blue bars, right? Except for the COVID year, the 2018, 2019, 2020, those years where we had a big jump up because of a change in policy. Aside from that, it looks pretty consistent, right? If you look across the years. However, now we turn the page to slide 5. And you will see on slide 5, after adjusting for inflation, it doesn't look so consistent. It looks like we've had a pretty big drop off in 2021. And the reason is that we need to inflate the dollar values back in 2010 by the value of inflation. And then we get those orange and greenish bars that are adjusted for 2 different measures that we'll be talking a lot about in a little bit. The CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and the PCE deflator, or the Personal Consumption Expenditure deflator. So I would argue that we should be thinking about those orange and green bars. And it looks like we had EITC average value pretty close to $700 for a number of years there, until the change in policy in 2018, when Vermont increased its EITC to 36% of the federal value. But what happened in 2021? So now I think we have an interesting story to tell, which is what happened in 2021 to drop the average value so much. And one partial explanation is that in 2021, a lot more single person households were eligible for the EITC, and those single person households would get a lower value of the EITC. And I suppose you could keep going with the analysis and you could think about, well, what's the average value for households that were like the households back in the 2010s compared to the 2021 households of that same type. But if you're looking at sort of not quite right data, in other words, not adjusted for inflation, then you don't even ask that question because you think, oh, we've just gone back to the old value where we were before. Okay, so it is often very important to adjust for inflation. That's my message. Yes.
But what I'm confused about is if we're not disaggregating the single people who are filing from the people who were filing before, then this doesn't really tell me anything.
Exactly. But you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't know to ask that question if you had looked at the previous graph and you said, oh, well, things were, pretty constant back then. And then we had this change in policy and we went back to about the same value, right? You wouldn't even think to ask, well, what's happening to the household composition, right? So that's part of my point. Okay, so it's important to look at inflation adjusted dollars. So now we're going to look at some historical inflation values. And I'm going to start on slide 7 with the consumer price index. This is probably the one that most people hear about on the news, the CPI. Unfortunately, it's not the one that the Federal Reserve looks at when they say, what should we be doing about inflation in the economy? We'll look at that PCE deflator in just a minute. But the consumer price index has been around a long time. It was started way back in the 40s. And you can see how it's gradually increased over time. And you can see what a big, sharp jump up there was in recent years since 2020. So that's the CPI. Officially, it's the CPI-U, the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, and it looks at a basket of goods. How much does it cost to purchase that basket of goods? And now if we turn to slide 8.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How big is that basket? How many goods?
It's a lot. I don't remember.
We're looking at
260. I mean, it's a lot.
Okay.
And
pretty diverse. There's the whole
very
idea.
diverse. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute.
Okay.
But first,
Sorry, one more.
Are the gray bars recessionary periods?
yes, absolutely. Yes. Yes. And I should mention that these very nicely done figures come from FRED, which is the Federal Reserve Economic Database out of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. So I've just lifted them off the internet, which is very convenient. Yes, they're very nice. And it's nice to see the recession years because you do see changes in the blips in those years. Okay, so I'm now looking at slide 8, and the new red line there, superimposed on the old CPI blue line, the new red line is the personal consumption expenditures price index. These are both set to about 100 or I should say, they're set to 100 in about 1982, so that they move in similar amounts. So you can see that the PCE index is growing a little bit less fast over time, right? So it is a different measure, and we will talk about why it's a different measure, and we'll talk about why the PCE index is actually the one that the Federal Reserve prefers when they're thinking about inflation. So when they say they have an inflation target of 2%, they're looking at the PCE index, not at the CPI. Okay, and just for another look, slide 9 looks at inflation. So this is the percentage change in that index over time from year to year. And you can see how the peaks in the CPI inflation measure are higher than the peaks in the PCE inflation measure, which again drives home the point that the CPI is rising faster than the PCE. Okay.
What does chain type mean?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that.
Great.
So, okay, let's keep going because, it comes up next. Which measure is best? Okay. So slide 11 talks about how the CPI from BLS is defined. And this is where you have to keep in mind that the CPI looks at a monthly measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. So there is a basket of goods that is well defined. It used to be that each item in the basket was extremely well defined. You had to buy a dozen eggs of, the brown, whatever type, or you had to buy 1 pound of chicken legs or whatever. For the last 20, 30 years, they've been improving the CPI bit by bit. And now they allow changes within very narrow categories. So you can now change from your pound of chicken legs to a pound of ground chicken, let's say. Okay? But it has to be very well defined within that narrow group.
Whatever you call it, excuse me, I'm interrupting. Like our fussing around with Streamlined.
Oh, how carefully you define, yeah.
And do those goods change? Is it just based on like consumer preferences so that we're tracking what's actually being purchased?
Yes. But again, the substitution is only within those specific categories. And we'll see that the PCE improves on that when we get to that measure. Yes, so I think I mentioned before, CPIU is based on the spending patterns of urban consumers. So for all of our rural folks, it's not exactly accurate. I've already talked about substitution within categories only. Oh, yes, it's interesting that the cost of shelter is measured for everybody using rental equivalents. So somebody tries to figure out, if you're a homeowner living in your house, what would it rent for? What's the market value of rent for that house? And that's how they include housing services in the CPI. Now, sometimes people are concerned about the Social Security Administration and their measure of inflation, which is a little bit different from the CPIU. Social Security Administration adjusts its benefits annually using the CPIW according to law. CPIW only refers to wage earners. So it does not include people who are unemployed or retired or whatever. Okay, so it's a slightly different measure, and that's why your Social Security adjustment is going to be a little bit different from the change in the CPI. Interesting, yes. Okay, the CPI is meant to reflect consumer purchases, so it does not include final goods and services bought by businesses and governments.
I'm not sure I understand the difference between the CPIU and the CPIW. I understand that you're doing it for wage earners. Does that mean you're looking at the wage earners, what they spend on the basket?
Yes.
As opposed to what the urban people spend on the same basket?
All urban people. So it's retirees, unemployed people, disabled, people with disabilities.
But the basket costs the same.
But they might be buying different things. Yeah. Their basket could be different from somebody else's basket. Yeah.
The wage earner's basket is different from the urban basket.
Well, they could be choosing to buy different things, right?
Can I clarify? So they're both urban baskets? Is that?
CPIW, I don't know if it's specified to be urban. Actually.
Okay.
It's specified to be wage earners for sure.
Okay. And CPIU
U is urban.
broader.
It's a broader population within urban areas.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Woody.
Do we even have an urban area as defined by whatever that's?
Burlington, South Burlington, Metropolitan.
That's the only.
And all the surrounding towns.
Yes. Yes.
Why is that?
It's the only place where we have dense enough population.
So it's based on
Density.
population.
I still don't think I understand the answer to Representative Taylor's question.
I'm still working on it myself.
So I guess I assume you presented like the human in charge of determining goes and gets the list of things and then adds it up, and that's the plot on the graph. So I guess I don't understand how a wage earner would be different than CPIU. Like,
So quantities matter as well, right? The item is defined, but the quantity that they buy could be different. The places they shop could be different, therefore the prices would be different for that specified item.
so when creating the sample, you might get the same items, but at different places, different quantities.
Absolutely.
And that
Yes, absolutely.
helps.
Yeah.
And so it's like the hypothetical, like average shopper, everyman of a wage earner versus the average shopper
In an urban
in an
environment.
urban environment who might not necessarily be a wage earner, could be anything from someone with a trust fund to someone on Social Security.
Correct,
Okay, thanks.
correct. And sometimes you do hear about the core CPI, and it is true that the Federal Reserve watches the core CPI in addition to the PCE deflator, and that would exclude food and energy because those prices jump around a lot. So often you hear about core CPI increased by blah, blah, blah today. So that's the market basket, excluding food and energy. Okay, so now we're moving to the personal consumption expenditure index, which is a chain weighted index. And here we are allowing what people buy to change every month. Okay, so every month they observe somebody in the Bureau of Economic Analysis observes what people are buying and at what prices, right? And so they are comparing what they're buying at what prices this period to what they bought at what prices last period. Okay. So it's chain weighted because it's slowly moving through time, right? There's a chain of purchases and prices through time.
Thanks.
Sort of. I mean, we could be more specific mathematically, but that's the idea. Okay. And the important thing here is that it really does reflect changes in consumer behavior. So if consumers move away from chicken completely and move to tofu, that would be reflected more accurately in the PCE deflator. And that explains, in large part, why the PCE deflator is moving less rapidly up, right, than the CPI, because you're allowing those changes in what is bought to affect the index.
So folks engaging in sort of what's described as rational economic behavior of swapping out likes. So say people might buy less eggs because the price has gone up and buy more cereal that would impact.
Absolutely, that's better reflected.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. This is very fun.
It's very fun. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this is the preferred measure that the Fed uses to measure inflation. So this is what they're thinking about today as they meet. We'll hear what they decide to do tomorrow. It's not that different. As you saw in the picture, it's not that different from the CPI, but it is considered to be more accurate. And for example, it's not just the Fed that follows the PCE deflator. When I was at the Congressional Budget Office, the decision was made to move to the PCE deflator rather than the CPI for anything involving consumers or consumption by households. So a lot of places are changing. Okay, so if I have a pitch today, it is going to be that in many of the places where the state of Vermont currently uses the CPI, perhaps we should be thinking hard about moving to the PCE deflator. Okay, now there are some other price indexes that you hear about and that are used in various places. So I thought I would just mention two more that are commonly cited. The first is the GDP price index. GDP stands for gross domestic product. And of course, it measures prices prices of goods and services produced in the US. So this is talking about the GDP of the US, everything that's produced here, including what we produce for exports, okay? It does not reflect the price of imports because they're not produced here, right? They're imported from elsewhere. So the GDP deflator or price index, either term can be used, reflects not only consumption goods and services, but also investment, long-term investment goods, and government spending. So it's the broadest measure that we have across the whole economy. Okay. Oh, yes, and it does, this one does include final goods and services bought by businesses and governments because it's supposed to be representing the entire economy. So it's all economic activity for goods and services produced in this country. Okay. And similar to that, but specific to state and local governments, is the state and local government deflator, which is used in Vermont, specifically in education finance applications, but other places as well. And so that is the ratio of today's GDP in Vermont to the constant dollar GDP in Vermont for state and local government. for the state and local government, okay? So you can see that state and local governments are buying different stuff at different prices than the federal government and the country as a whole. So here we have the blue line, which represents state and local price index, implicit price deflator, and we have the red line that represents all of GDP, okay? So one huge difference is that all of GDP includes all of the defense equipment, machinery, airplanes, blah, 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 blah. And those are not included in our state and local spending because we don't have Vermont government buying up whatever, big planes and whatever, nuclear bomb. Okay, so you will hear in the economic forecast, for example, the consensus economic forecast by Tom and Jeff, and in education, finance, other places, you will hear state and local government implicit price deflator being used.
And when I remember having this described to me in the past, it was that this deflator was the one that was sort of most sensitive to salary needs and salary changes and health insurance costs, because it was sort of very personnel based.
Yes, because the state government spends a huge portion of its spending on salaries, yes.
Representative Woody?
I'm just it's a little off, but you were saying maybe we should go to PCE instead of CPI. Who makes the decision of which one to use? You mean within JFO?
No, JFO does not make that decision. That would be a legislative decision. So it's in statute in many places that this amount will be adjusted by the CPI. Yeah, it's in statute.
So, all right, so what I'm hearing you, am I hearing you correctly saying we ought to look at that as an issue?
Yes. Yes, and I think you will get support from folks at JFO. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, considerations. Right, so my message, as I said, is that when you are looking at data over time that's in nominal or current dollars, you really ought to ask the presenter if some inflation adjustment would be appropriate. And the answer is probably yes these days, because inflation has been 5%, 8% recently. And that's going to matter for looking back over time. When inflation for many, many years was 1 or 2% per year, it takes a long time to add up to much, right? But when inflation gets to be 5% and then 8% or 9%, and who knows what it's going to be this year, should be coming down, we hope. But that's going to add up more quickly, okay? Another approach is to look at some measures as a share of something else. And my favorite example of this is back in CBO days when we were looking at the national debt. And the national debt is in trillions of dollars, right? And what does it mean to be trillions of dollars to any sane person with a normal sized head, right? I mean, it's just way beyond anything you can imagine. But if you express the debt as a percentage of GDP, and you now realize that debt is close to or more than 100% of GDP, I haven't checked my numbers lately, but it's very close to 100% of GDP. That's how much the national debt is, right? That is meaningful because you think, all right, this is how much we produce in a year and we have that much debt, okay? And it's scheduled to keep going up and up and up. Thanks to COVID time spending and other spending, yes.
I've often seen the percent of GDP as a way of comparing countries. Is that valid?
GDP. Oh, I see. So what's the size of France compared to the size of the US?
France's debt is
Sure.
85% of GDP and ours is 100.
Sure.
That is a valid way of comparing countries?
Sure. Well, it's
Depending
comparing the
on what-
debt held by the country, right? Sure. Because France has a certain production capability or capacity, I guess I should say. And their debt is 85% of that. And we have a certain capacity in our production and our debt is whatever, 100% of that. Sure. Okay.
France is 101.1.
Excuse me?
Is that right?
101.1%.
Oh,
And what's the US? Are you seeing that too?
It's probably big.
Is it up? Is it
Big.
more than?
that's good.
99.6.
Ah,
Oh,
close. Yeah,
We're just behind France.
yeah. Okay. Oh, so, yes, so I think it would be interesting to look at state of Vermont spending as a share of Vermont GDP over time, just to see what's happening. Because we have this idea that spending is always going up and up and up. And it's probably true to some extent that GDP continues to go up and up and up, but which is growing faster. And if we looked at shares, we could get that answer. Okay. So the first idea is, yes, you need to adjust for inflation. The second idea is, well, which measure is best to use in which situation? So you are certainly welcome to ask data users, did you adjust for inflation? And if so, which measure did you use and why? Right? Because there should be a good reason behind the choice. If it's consumer spending, then the choice ought to be either the PCE deflator, my choice number one, or the CPI index, right? If it's something that involves investment, long-term capital investment, like housing or like state investments in infrastructure and so forth, then you might want to consider using the state and local government price index, because that includes investment goods as well as consumption goods in it.
another one?
Yeah.
Does the PCE include the food and fuel?
Yes, it does.
So, which is like what percent of a person of the,
Oh, it's big,
yeah. So it would seem to me that it's
40%.
more accurate, but it's also more volatile, the PCE.
Yeah, and that brings up another good point, which is that the CPI has been around such a long time that there are all kinds of CPI indexes. And in fact, one that's used in Vermont statute, we'll see in just a minute, is the Northeast Region CPI, okay? So not only are you looking at a market basket of goods defined so-and-so, but you're looking at the price of that market basket of goods only in the Northeast states, right? And then you can look at the CPI just for food or just for housing or just for this and that and the other. So there are lots and lots and lots of CPI indexes. That's less true for the PCE.
Yeah.
So do we run the risk of, as a state, if we start saying, oh, we're gonna look at this inflator or this inflator, of creating sort of like a inconsistent view of what's happening in the state if we're using different measures?
So that depends on your point of view, and it depends on how carefully you chose which measure to use in which place, right? So if you can justify, these are clearly consumption items and I'm using the PCE deflator, and these are clearly, a broader group of activities, including investment and so forth, then you can justify using the state and local government price index.
But I can imagine a situation where someone might want to use, make sure that revenues would cover costs of something, and they might use one inflator for revenue and a different inflator for costs in order to prove, in order to have those two numbers, in order to close that gap, right? And that JFO would never do that, but I could imagine that might happen sometimes in,
Certain situations.
certain conversations, and that would be, I think, a situation to be particularly careful of.
It's also true that there may be political reasons to use one index rather than another, and you have to be careful of that as well. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so now, where is Vermont using inflation adjustments in the statutes? Well, so I'm familiar with a number of places, but I'm sure there are lots of other places. So minimum wage law is a prime example. The minimum wage in Vermont is indexed to the CPI, not to exceed 5%. So the actual months that they look at are September 1st of the previous year, like 2 previous years, through August 30th of the, okay, I have to be more specific, for the increase in the minimum wage in January 2023. they looked at the CPI from September 1st, 2021 to August 30th, 2022. And that can be explained by the fact that they have to have data in order to set the minimum wage going forward. And they have to be able to tell firms what the minimum wage will be starting January 1st so that firms can pay workers the right amount of wages and so forth. So in 2022, the minimum wage was $12.55 and it increased to $13.18. Okay, and that's based on the CPI, but if the CPI increase were more than 5%, then by law, that increase is limited to 5%. Okay. In education finance, I've mentioned that the state and local government deflator is used. It's used to grow the grand list. That is used in data underlying the yield model. It's used to calculate block grants for special education. And I imagine that when you think about the grand list, you're thinking about what's the value of housing, which involves investment and long-term capital and so forth. And that's the reason why they decided to use state and local government deflator. State pensions, you see CPI floating around a lot, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what applies to which groups because there are 6 different groups, and there are teachers, and there are state employees, and they all have slightly different bargaining agreements. But some do use the Northeast region CPI, some use the nationwide CPI-U. Group C and F going forward as part of the new pension agreement last year decided to increase by the CPI not to exceed 4%. So that's not terribly generous. And they specify that there's no adjustment if CPI inflation is less than either 1% or 0%. So that's quite common, actually, that if you have negative inflation, if you have deflation, prices are going down, you might limit the adjustment to be 0 so that you can't reduce the value of a benefit or the minimum wage or whatever. Okay. Vermont reach-up amounts are, I thought this was sort of interesting, actually. They're adjusted each year by looking at the cost of basic needs that are defined also in statute. You adjust the cost of those basic needs by the CPI, and you also look at.
Sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry. I looked at the chart backwards.
Okay, so we're talking reach up. You adjust basic needs by the CPI, and you also look at current housing costs. But then you look at the amount of funding that was made available by the legislature, and you decide how much you can give to each family.
And you deflate it from there.
So it might be only, 49% of what the costs are, but you only have that much funding to go around to people. So, okay, I thought that was interesting. Town highway aid is adjusted by the CPI. They look back over 2 years of CPI growth. Campaign finance amounts are adjusted by the CPI. Renewable energy programs, they use the Northeast region CPI. So those were examples that I was able to gather up quickly. I've not done an exhaustive search of Vermont statute, but that could be done.
Yeah, Representative.
Is there, does our Department of Labor, which I think calculates most of these, do they also collect data on a state basis for producer price index materials? Or
right, so that's another one that you do hear about on the news. I don't remember if I've seen that on their website or not. It's easy enough to find if you just Google producer price index, right? I think it's put out by the.
I mean, you look at the transportation and highway, and to treat them as a consumer is sort of odd.
It's unusual.
Unusual.
Yes. Yes. So that's what I have prepared for you. I'm happy to answer more questions or talk more in the weeds or whatever.
Yeah.
This might be too granular, so apologies in advance, but how does the Northeast region CPI differ?
So people in the Northeast are spending more on fuels, heating fuels, for example, where we're getting our electricity from different sources, so the price of electricity is going to be different from the rest of the country. We have differences in the price of food because we're importing from other parts of the country, our food, especially in the winter. So you can see that there would be reasons why it would be different from the country as a whole.
Anyone else? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Appreciate it. I'm gonna
Having me.
keep this one in my back pocket as we talk about other things throughout the session. Maybe we'll hang it on the wall, who knows?
Very good. Thank you.
And we will be back here tomorrow morning at some time, 9 a.m.